these days of Amherst that we're sort of looking at, which we're, 1980, 81. Yeah. Which this was the last training Feldenkrais ever taught in. And so he died in 84. So what we've been working around June 81. And he was 80 when he died. So 78 here. Yeah. That's yeah. So it was really hot. Okay, and he gave tons of talks. And I mean, he did the lessons we've been doing, but he interspersed them with lots and lots of talks. So it's pretty appropriate that we're having a little discussion about one of his talks today, I thought. Okay, now this talk is called, wait a minute, Being Straight and Perception, Corrections Perceived as Errors, an error in the opposite direction. And we do hope that Jenny's going to kindly put this up on the, whatever your knowledge base is the words up. Thank you. Knowledge base. So I'm just going to pick out a few things and we're going to have a little chat about them. Okay. So the first thing is, learning can be inconvenient. Learning can be inconvenient. And with this, he begins to talk about himself, which is, I'm interested in this. I think we are interested in our teachers, and there were 200 people in the room there. So this is much more intimate. I'm not going to talk about myself, but he talked about his knees. And I'm sure by now you've all heard that his knees were a real problem. And they really came from when he was a soccer player. But he also talks about the fact that people thought he was a wonderful soccer player and that he would always save the goal, and how reliable he was, and how this got in the way of looking after himself, and what idiocy it was. I think we've all experienced this a bit. Anyway, so what's also, anyway, the knees, there are the knees. But then he started to lift his shoulder and take it forward. So I think maybe you could stand up and give this a go. So if you lift your right shoulder and take it forwards, and now walk. Now, what's happening to your gait? What's happening to your walking? Now drop your shoulder and walk. I do like these funny walks. I'm sorry they didn't invite me to do the funny walks, but anyway, I can't. Now go up again with this shoulder. And what does it do? Any ideas? Shifts the weight to the left, changes your neck. What was that other? Shortens the left side? Yeah, you can't breathe. Yeah. Yeah, where are your eyes? Okay, so what's happening to your knees? They're horrible, aren't they? And you're pushing into the floor? Yeah? Okay, and let that go and walk for a tick. Just walk for a tick. Now this, I mean, what we were doing then was so obvious in a way. Our whole right side was sort of rigid, the knee was rigid, as well as all the other things you said, which were absolutely right. But this time, just lift your shoulder a fraction and take it forwards. Just rather than this, which is what I invited you to do, but just do it the tiniest imperceptible bit and feel what happens. It's still there, isn't it? It's still there. Exactly. It's more profound. It is. Because that tiny, and this is what we're doing to ourselves all the time, everywhere. Anyway, so in this, which you will read when it's on the knowledge base, knowledge, oh, good, knowledge base, that he really tells, there's someone with buttons here that I keep standing on, that he really describes, what happened to him. And then he said someone, and I'm fascinated to know who someone was, who said to him, look, all right, your knees aren't too good, but look what you're doing with the rest of you, which is not helping you at all. Which is really interesting. And again, there's that point that so often we need someone to tell us, because how can we know we're doing this, which is so tiny and yet so profound? But also he goes on to say in this talk that if you drop your shoulder and take it back and then feel you're walking, and you've really got to have that experience to make the shift of letting go of that habit. Because, if it's a habit of 2 or 3 years, it's part of you. It's totally part of you. So how can we, and there are lots of little ways, lots of little tricks, which is, of course, to tighten and take your shoulder forwards on the other side and feel what happens. If it was an habitual thing for you, you can invite people to do that so they can sense the differences. So if you're just walking now quietly, and it's all that stuff that Julie's been talking about, that you wait, you're just finding the floor and moving, and it's enabling you to move one foot then the other, rather than the pushing into the floor. And then Feldenkrais goes on to talk about what is walking. And walking is losing your balance and regaining it, falling forwards and regaining it. It's not a static thing. You're falling forwards and you regain. Now, if you think of that idea of falling and regaining your balance, what happens to the way you're contacting the floor? So you're forwards a little bit, you're falling and regaining. It's lighter, isn't it? Is it lighter? You're just gliding over the floor. Now, one foot after the other. I need to balance on one leg, balance on the other. What happens to the way you use your legs? So if you just stop on one foot, feel what happens in your legs. Now, away you go with that rhythm and the idea of going forwards. Feel that your breathing is easy. Okay, so while we're on our feet, I thought we were going to have a nice little chat sitting down, but no, never happens. Never happens. Okay, so now let's think about another concept, which is posture. Now, we all know here that that is about being unstable in a stable position. Constantly, we're moving with those tiny little muscles all around us, everywhere. Okay, so all those absolutely mad things that we're told as children, put your shoulders back, now walk. How many times did our parents tell us to put our shoulders back? Okay. And let them go and just walk. Now stop again. Now what about stand up straight? What does that do to your breathing? What breathing? So anyway, maybe I'll let you all sit down now because you've worked hard this morning with that rolling. So there's a lot that Feldenkrais talks about here. What is straight? Well, if we look at our friend over here, the skeleton, there's nothing too straight, really. We've got the curve of our neck and our lumbar curve. And he talks about that the middle of our lumbar is about the only straight part of our spine, because it's built for these spiral movements. So straight is actually a meaningless thing. So just to think about that, and we've all seen people in our practices or walking down the street, and they've clearly been told to do something which they're doing without feeling or a sense of themselves. It's as though it's imposed from outside. Okay, now, wait a minute, I've got off the track a bit, just a tick. Just let me think about this for a minute. So it is about making distinctions, and he talks a lot about that in this article, and about making the environment for people to feel the distinctions, to feel how is it, just as we've been just doing just then, how is it to impose something, how is it to actually sense what is comfortable for us. Any questions so far? Any comments? All clear. Beautiful. Beautiful. So if, for example, the lifting and taking forward of your shoulder, which affects everything going down that side, if you're told just to drop your shoulder, guess what? Tomorrow it's up and forwards again. So to create the experience is what is really, really important. How does that make sense? And that's really our job, is to help us make sense for people. Why it is we're making a suggestion, why it is that there's trouble with your knee when you've lifted your shoulder. And you know what comes first, the knee or the shoulder, is of no interest. Who cares? But so often what happens, we can be working with somebody and they say, oh, I remember 20 years ago I had an injury there. And that has impacted on what they're sensing 20 years later. It is quite extraordinary, but that, of course, that's their experience and that's what they're holding in themselves. So It's quite nice, those moments, because then we can unpack that and play around with the ideas. So then Feldenkrais talks about a young cerebral palsy child who he'd been seeing, and the child came and was unable to sit or hold her head up or do anything when she first came. He's quite good at telling you, you know, the good stories. I often wonder about the stories that didn't work, but anyway, that's that's all right. But we hear all the good stories. Anyway, this child did really well and could stand on one leg, and it was all fabulous. But what she didn't do was to then use her abilities to walk. And her father was in the room, and she wouldn't take those steps to him. She wanted him to pick her up because he had all her life. All her life, he picked her up and carried her around. And so there's a huge step there between having the ability and the motivation, and then finding the motivation. And again, it's what Julie was talking about this morning, a little bit about the transference of that information, then transferring it into something that is useful and that you want to do. And of course, that takes yet another lot of effort or will or motivation. So apparently the child screamed the place down for some time, and Moshe told the father to sit where he was and not move. And you can see the whole scene. And as he talks about there, you know, the guilt of the parents, they've had this child's not A1, whatever that means, let's face it. But anyway, the child then walked, of course, after a lot of screaming and carrying on. But it's that point, that place between having the ability and being willing to use it. It's quite...
Is it moving from a safe place into an unknown place?
Well, I'm sure that's part of it.
Okay. It's the real self-image stuff that she has such a picture of herself, and that's just too big a step.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So it's all those things. And of course, moving in space, through space, is much scarier than, but there is that thing of taking what we learn into function and into different places. Yes, but you're absolutely right, self-image. Yeah. And here's one of our and in this lecture, do you want to say something a little bit? Beautifully done.
I can sort of see it as like a creative adjustment when the tactics you usually use stop working. Like babies do this all the time. Suddenly there's no one there to give them the food they want, so they've got to start moving towards it. There's a creative process, and I guess Moshe might have familiarized the process of walking enough for it to be the next thing she tried.
Yeah. Exactly. And at the end of this short part of the talk is one of the famous quotes from Moshe, which is, "There is nothing so permanent in behaviour than our belief that it is so." Anyway, then he goes into quite a little talk about, he read this quote and he thought, what a very good quote. And then he turned over the page and saw it was his own. That's such a story for him. You know, he's really, it is stunning. It is stunning. Anyway. Then he talks about this idea that a correction can be perceived as an error. And again, we touched on that. But it is so foreign and so non-habitual that it can't possibly be good for you or right for you. You know, so, and that's where the confusion comes. And, you know, often we talk about out of confusion comes learning. We learn when we're confused. We learn when we make mistakes.
If someone's grown up in an environment where mistakes are not allowed, where they're punished for mistakes, that's a really big thing for them to
It's huge.
move through.
And we all have faced it in a way.
In different ways, yeah.
Yeah, in
to
different ways.
extents. Yeah.
To different extents, I agree. It's huge if you're punished for making a mistake. Well, it's horrible.
Or you're not, as a child, encouraged to have even choice. So you're punished for choice. I'm thinking of a particular family person, like a family friend, and the way that they, you know, with their daughter. I'm thinking about her and the impact that that's had on her, and then her inability to change. Yeah.
Feldenkrais actually, I mean, I hope I'm accurate with this. This isn't in the talk, but he went to a school where for 3 months information was conveyed, you know, in all subjects. And then for the next 3 months, that was all refuted. So that they were taught to look at anything from many different points of view and many different ways, and to be able to argue on both sides.
Yeah. Nancy and I had a really good chat about that yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a way, that's what we're looking at as well. It's what Julie calls options, different possibilities. We can look at things in different ways. And it's very confining when there's only one way. Which is, of course, what attracted me to this work. It's great. Always finding different ways. So are you happy with this quote of a correction is always felt as an error of the same magnitude in the opposite direction? A correction is always felt as an error of the same magnitude in the opposite direction. So, if, for example, I say, you know, I'm sitting here like this, and I say, let your shoulders go, how do I feel really? I feel a bit like an ape by comparison. I'm ready to go like this. Do you see? I think this is right. You know, I think this is how to be in the world. I get a lot of back pain. I can't speak. My throat is totally constricted. My legs are shaking. They're working so hard. And someone comes along and says, let it go. Let it go means nothing. It's like the word relax. I'm not keen on the word relax either. It's totally meaningless. But if I give someone something to do, which is Feel that you can take your weight through your feet and just, where are your arms? Sense your breathing. And it can be, how tall are you? How long does your neck feel? But you're giving information rather than just correcting. All right? And that's what we do. That's what I hope we do.
Yeah. I thought I'd spare Ella.
So the reason he said that was, just to paraphrase, you said it, but it just sort of landed on me, is that we're not in the business of correcting, because often that does feel like an error in the opposite direction. We're in the business of giving information that the person can choose or can feel in themselves feels better. It doesn't feel like an error or a correction.
No, except that he is saying sometimes you're feeling, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, after an ATM or an FI, you do feel in such a different place that is so foreign.
So it's very non-usual, non-habitual.
Yes, non-habitual.
Weird.
Weird.
Doesn't necessarily feel better, perhaps.
No.
Just weird.
Weird, and a whole lot of other things. So it's hard sometimes to take that on, which is, of course, why we do things in different orientations, in different ways, to try and get that information. So he is saying sometimes, that the learning can be uncomfortable, can feel totally out of place. And, of course, it also depends on the length of time that you've been holding some of these habits. And you know what, one of my, not in this lecture, but this is a Margaret Mayo special, is, the minute we got onto seats in school is when the rot set in, is my view. We weren't free to move around. And of course, the other moment about school, of course, is sit up straight and don't wriggle. And of course, wriggling is quite fun and quite good. And you're just adjusting. Wriggling is actually adjusting and making yourself feel more comfortable. On the other hand, the other point he makes in here is that I think after people had been doing 4-point kneeling and doing the judo rolls and things, their wrists were a bit tricky, and so they'd go like this. And he makes a real thing about don't shake it out, stay with it. So you see, there's wriggling and wriggling. But it's this, but I'm sure we've all done that when you feel really uncomfortable, and so you go like this. That his thought is that you then go back to your habit, which is being unable to take your weight through your hands or whatever you're shaking away from. Box.
Sorry.
Good, isn't it? Oh, yes. So if this is returning to habit, so the other day we were talking about cramps.
Yes.
So would Feldenkrais say, stay with the cramp?
That's a bit tricky. I don't
Would
think.
it?
I don't think.
Or do
No,
you
because I don't think a cramp is comfortable
but then
movement.
Julie said it's also because the other side, well, the
the antagonist.
yeah, that one.
Yeah.
Wasn't
Doing
engaged,
its stuff.
Doing its stuff. So then do you stay with the cramp and focus on the other side?
I don't think so. I think a cramp is very
it's very
uncomfortable.
painful.
It's very
But
painful.
then so is that. Can be. So
Yes, but you're not. So he's not saying he's not saying maintain the extension of your wrist that's causing. He's saying just rest rather than doing this. So when you've got a cramp, you just find some weight if it's in your foot, and you just quietly move around and let it equilibrate. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Anyone else got anything more to say about the cramps? Certainly not holding on to them. Okay. Now, then in this, he also talks about a conversation he had with Ida Rolfe. Now, does anyone know about Rolfing? A little bit. So she worked with connective tissue, basically. And basically, well, what he says here, now you've got to be a bit careful with what he says here, but basically he says, she said she had 10 lessons and she'd take people through them, and then that would have been through their whole being, connective tissue. She then went on to say that Greta Garbo came 2 or 3 times a year to see her for 26 years. So his remark is, how can she possibly think that a recipe of 10 lessons is going to suit everyone? And why did Greta Garbo have to come back for 26 years? And then he says, of course, I've got people who come back to me for that long. So, but the point really is, there is no recipe.
And those people would have been developing. And those people would have been developing.
Up here.
Those people coming back possibly would have been developing more of themselves rather than just doing the same things.
One would hope so.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm sure he would say.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's certainly, I think we've all seen Feldenkrais work, and we've all experienced his incredible variation and number of different awareness through movement lessons. I can't believe he'd ever do the same thing twice on anyone, because he's always in there with that person, responding, suggesting, making possibilities, giving them. And certainly I've got people who've been coming to my awareness through movement lessons now for over 20 years. But they come because of a variety. And yeah. And I think, unlike most other modalities, we don't do the same routine every week. It's always different, which, stimulates all those things that we've been talking about, the curiosity, and this is what our brains, they love something different. And our brains spend their time trying to predict what's going to happen, and then it doesn't happen, and that's what it's all about. So anyway, okay, now, and then the next thing he talked about in this famous talk that you're all going to read is about the Canadian billionaire. So the Canadian billionaire was sent to him by, what's his name? It's written in there. The Prime Minister of Israel that stood on his head. Right, thank you. Okay, he was sent along. Anyway, the first part of the story was that Moshe had felt that the Canadian billionaire had had enough lessons. But the billionaire wanted to keep coming. So he said, all right then, well, you can come, and each time you come, you can pay twice as much as last time. So when it got to 16 times as much, the billionaire had had enough. But then he went on to talk about the billionaire's wife. And I'm not sure about the sequence of events in this, but anyway, the billionaire then sent his wife along. And it must have been the first time he'd been there, because, or he brought his wife. Anyway, he was surprised at how modest. There was no receptionist. Moshe wasn't in a white coat. You, Dr. Feldenkrais, there was nothing smart about it. Anyway, at that, the wife didn't think much of the whole situation clearly, and went off to have surgery. And then Moshe describes how she got into all this trouble, and she'd had an infection, and she was 6 months in the hospital, and how terrible it was. And for 10 days with me, she would have been a new woman. Anyway, I think you've got to read this because he tells it so well. But these are just things to think about. But, I don't know about you, but sometimes our friends, even our clients, are hell-bent on having or our family members are hell-bent on having some surgery. And there comes to the point you just got to let them have it. It's really hard. And I mean, I'm sure you all know about the huge survey done on arthroscopies for knees. And this huge experiment was done, and basically half the people had a cut in their knee, and the other half had the arthroscopy and the grinding around. And there was no difference in the outcome. I quite like it, though, with the cut in the knee, because, you see, they thought they'd had it. I mean, just think about that. It's a brilliant piece of work. And I'd like to say that the health funds are still paying for arthroscopies. And we're supposed to be in trouble because we're not evidence-based. So all I'm saying is that's the way of the world, and we just get on with it. Okay, so that's that one. So you can see there's a lot covered in this little talk in the heat outside. Now, another really interesting thing that he talks about here is other systems, other techniques. And he just mentions Rolfing, Alexander, osteopathy, chiropractic. And he says, they do a bit. They do a bit. But he also says, if you feel comfortable, you keep on doing that, if that's your livelihood. But he said, what we are doing is fundamental. And that those things, without what we do, will not last, will not hold, will not make sense to people. So I think that's about one of the few times I've ever seen him even acknowledge anyone else. And for me, it is a criticism that you can take from all these different modalities and not acknowledge where they came from. Like some of the yoga things, that the poses, of course, the way he treats them are different, but down face dog, up face dog, and all those other things. I don't know much about yoga. But all I'm saying is there are certain things he's taken and then adapted and run with. But of course, we're dealing with human movement. So it's going to be. But I really strongly suggest that you read his biography by Mark Rees, because it is an extraordinary book. Jenny's got it. It's a great big fat book. It does cost $100. But it really gives you his incredible breadth of experience and reading from where he took and where he sort of created his genius somehow. I mean, he worked really hard. Jerry Carson was his assistant for many, many years. And he came into our house and we just had a wall of books. And Jerry came into our house and said, have you read all these books? And, yes and no. But what was interesting to me, he said, Moshe had thousands of books and he had read them all. And I just thought, that was a man who really worked at his process, really, and worked at his, his knowledge. All right, now, I think that might do me. What have I left out, Julie? All right, any questions about anything? Throw them.
Challenging. I was thinking about people who arrive to the method or look responses to their problems. Some people try a feldenkrais method and say, no, it's too slow. I can't. I need something more. I don't know, movement, or that I feel my body. And sometimes I'm thinking of that as maybe there are some people are not ready to get into a compromise work, and they need to pass to different other techniques or other methods or other response, and then finally they arrive to say, okay, maybe I'm ready now. or I don't know, or remember, something resonates, but the other techniques or the other forms of movements it depends in which moment is the person also to understand things.
I agree.
Because it doesn't have any sense. If I talk to someone and in many creative ways that I could do in the right, and they said, no, I prefer.
Well, they want someone else to fix them.
Yeah.
And many other modalities make promises.
Yeah.
And I'll just have a little confession now. You ready for it? Do you like a little confession?
Yes.
For my sins, I'm actually president of the Australian Feldenkrais Guild, Australia, of the Guild. And it's not easy, because people want us to market and to spread the word and to, it's, as you will find as you go into your practices, it's very difficult to market because we don't promise anything. And because we're honest to the method. We're dealing with humans who have a whole range of different issues. Maybe they want to learn, maybe they don't. And the thing is that, I understand what you're saying about it can be slow, it can be this, but I've seen people in one lesson change and get what they want. Now, I'm not saying every person I see that happens to, of course it doesn't. But there's a huge spectrum. And all we can do is talk about it creatively in the way you do, and just offer. And people will be ready, they won't be ready. I mean, I've got a great friend. Oh, she says, this feldenkrais. You know, I mean, I've known her a long time. Oh, she says, just like Pilates. I know, I've done both. Well, you know, what do I do with that? I'm the president of the guild and I can't deal with that. And I can't deal with it. I now just let it go, except when I heard her telling someone else that, I said, actually, it's not correct. Well, she came to 10 of my lessons. Do you see? So, but all I'm saying is, I'm sorry, it's not an easy path that we've all chosen. It's not an easy path. And I think, you know, it's fine. And as long as you've got a friend to ring up and say, oh my God, did you hear what I heard today? And, you know, feel free to ring me up any time and I'll give it to you on the other end. Don't worry, in spades. You know, this is the thing, but it's incredibly exciting. But what are you going to tell us?
Well, I'm interested in that statement. I wonder if we should spend more time with whoever, understanding what motivates them. We've just talked about that in the method, because I think human beings in general like to learn. Well, actually, I know for a fact human beings like to learn at some level. So when you can connect with that, their motivation, not about the method, I think you'll be able to connect with most people. So that's it. I think as feldenkrais practitioners, and I'm not a practitioner, but I think that is our challenge, not the learning of the method.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
yeah. I know. I agree.
sharing.
I agree, Sean. I agree.
I just didn't want to go all down the track.
Oh, Jenny's going to say something.
You've heard me say lots of things about finding ways to engage with people and the importance of listening for their motivation, for their needs, their interests, and finding a connection. And sometimes we find it and sometimes we don't. And I can think some years back I had a friend who had been through horrific childhood trauma and was starting to trust me and want to begin to make changes to make her life more comfortable. But for quite some time, the only way I could get my hands on her was if there was loud rhythmic music playing and we made really rhythmic movements. And over time, we began to be able to quieten things down, let go of the music, and eventually I could do something that was a little bit more like what we might recognise as the Feldenkrais method, but it wasn't where I started.
Yeah, that's really nice, Jenny. That's really nice.
How did you work that out to put loud music on with her? Like, what kind of process led you to do that?
Willingness to experiment and to notice opportunities. So, it's a while back, I can't remember the details, but, you know, there obviously was music on and at different times. But yeah, I mean, experimenting, trying different things.
It's a big one, this one. Yeah. I agree with you totally, Shah. And I also think, as Margaret said, it's not everyone's cup of tea. It's just the way it is. It's not everyone's cup of tea. People can still be interested in learning, but this particular way, you know, so, you know, when Margaret was talking about, you know, I'll get clients, they've been to the physio and they've been to Pilates, and they're easy to work with because they're active learners. They're still hoping that something can be different. Do you know what I mean? They're still sort of engaged in an active process. And I suppose one of the things that's really interesting, because, you know, I think there's great physios, I think there's great chiropractors, I think there's, because of how they deal with people and create learning environments. So often I think how we're different is we're making people more self-actualizing, more self-regulating. Do you know what I mean? Is what we're after. So often one of the questions I'll ask clients is, what did you learn about this from going to the physio? What did you learn about what you can do about? Yeah, because I think that's where we're different. I think that's one of the things that we're bringing in, this whole component of learning. So I'm really happy when clients come in with their gym program. I think it's fantastic. They're going to the gym, and we'll go through it from a feldenkrais perspective and go, how could this movement be a little easier? You're struggling with it. You're in your habit. Do you know what I mean? What could you pay attention? And the biggest thing is with a lot of people that they can actually say to their personal trainer, or they can say, this isn't working for me. Could you give me some other options or ways of doing this? Because then I know they're on the path, do you know what I mean, of being able to ask for what they need to. But I think that's where we're basically very different from. But I think to get people's motivation, it's really easy to say. I don't think people even know half the time what their motivation is. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? But to really get to, it's a little bit like, I think, when feldenkrais talk about unavowed dreams. They're literally unavowed. Why are you really going to the gym? Yeah. But you've got to, you know, where can you have that conversation? You can probably if you've got a one-on-one person. Probably not as easy if you've got a lot of people in your class and, you know, you're dealing with a lot of things. But I think they're really rich questions to think about. Yeah? And I think a big part of it is us being an active learner and not our ego not getting caught up.
Exactly.
The feldenkrais method. That we know it's valuable. Do you know what I mean? As Margaret said, and I'm going to try and find ways, as Jen said, being experimental, finding where to meet the person. But, you know, some people at that point in time, it's not their cup of tea.
Yeah.
But isn't it wonderful that we could get, if we could say, okay, so you really love doing Pilates. I've got an idea that if you just do a little bit of feldenkrais, that it's going to make your Pilates even easier. So not to sort of try and say, don't do Pilates, but what could we add to what you're already enjoying? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Can I just tell one quick story? And it's about, in response to your question to Jenny about how did you choose loud music. It's just, Julie and I have this friend who we trained with, and she was seeing quite an A-lead cellist. And, you know, they tried a few things in setting and the cellist was having a lot of difficulty. And then, so our friend, colleague, got the client to bring her cello, and then it still wasn't working. And then she got her to lie on the bed with the cello and did all this stuff, lying, and then got up, and it was extraordinary. Now, how did she get to there? Know what, she hadn't had the experience in her training. She just was open, and this is what we're trying to develop. This is the fabulous thing. Anything goes. Almost. Within the code of conduct. Oh, trust you, Jenny. But what I mean, you've still got all our principles with no principle, our principle of no principles, but how can we learn? Active learners. How can yeah. One more. I think you've.
It's actually just where I go and do a regular ATM. There's a woman. She comes in, and every week she says, "Oh, my life would be incomplete without coming here once a week." Yes, it's like my life would be incomplete without coming here once a week, because this relates to everything I do. She's almost like, it's not she says, she tells lots of different stories, but she tells these wonderful stories about how it relates to her psychological state and how she does the washing and everything. Yeah, she's a fantastic. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's just she comes once a week, and then that's it.
So she's got that ability to transfer
Yeah.
a lot of our
Yeah.
clients. That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
How to take what we're doing in mind and transfer it.
Yeah.
She is emotional life.
Yeah.
Just one thing. Go.
How do you explain to your patients or students, usually probably it's newcomers, when they, after the ATM or functional integration, and probably not necessarily at the same day, it might be feedback, next day, they tell you, we feel so relaxed. How do you explain them what they really feel, or what does mean being relaxed for them?
I think that's a big one.
Honestly, that's a question you need to answer, Nina, that you can begin to go, what is it that we're doing? What am I trying to give people a sense? So